For those who are not familiar with you, or even the notion of Ebonics and where it came from, you made your public debut about 20 years ago during the uproar around Oakland Public School District wanting a proposal to teach Ebonics to Black children in school. Can you take us back and give, for those who are not aware, more information about the proposal and how you kind of rose as the thought leader on Black English or Ebonics?
No, I'm not the thought leader on it, but it's interesting that you trace, like, whatever reason I'm sitting here back to that, because you're correct, but it's not something that many people have any reason to know. Basically, it was, I can't believe that it was 20 years ago now, that the Oakland School Board, and this was a primarily Black school board with a largely Black and brown public school population, were alarmed that children in the school system who were Black were failing so much, particularly in reading. So they were operating on a hypothesis that had gotten around in some parts of the country here and there before, that perhaps part of Black kids' problem in school was that their home dialect was Black English, which you can think of as a separate system from Standard English, and that so when they were encountering Standard English on the page, they were encountering basically a different language, and it was hard to make the switch. So the idea was not to teach them a dialect they already spoke, but to use the dialect in teaching materials and to call special attention to the fact that there are two different ways for them of speaking English. So the idea was to use it as kind of a translation tool. Now, the media just jumped on this and completely misunderstood what was meant by dialect, what was meant by using it in the classroom, and so the big joke was that basically Ebonics, which is a name for Black English no one had heard of until then except for a few education scholars in about 1973, that this Ebonics was going to be taught in class as opposed to Standard English. And this was right around when round-the-clock cable news started. It was Christmas, and so it was a slow news cycle. Fox News was new, and so there was a reason why this became such a big deal at that time. So the whole country is laughing at this idea that there's something called Ebonics that is actually language, or a language, as people put it. And I was in a weird position, because to tell you the truth, I came out of that despised by the Black English establishment. To this day, there are people of that sort who will walk by me at a conference and not say a word. Literally, that's how mean people get about it. Because I said, Black English is legitimate speech, but it's not why these kids are having problems in school. And I talked about problems I'm sure we've all heard about, inner city schools. I said, that's the problem. It's not the dialect. We don't need to give it special attention in the classroom. I think I was misunderstood, and I didn't have the experience then that I do now in trying to get out of my own head. So really, it was, if I may, the expression today is a shit show. The whole thing in the media was a shit show. My life was a shit show. But that is how it started, because that's when people got the idea that I was, quote unquote, interesting. So that's what happened.
So where did the term Ebonics actually come from?
It was something somebody made up in good faith in about 1973. There was a psychologist, a Black psychologist, who was concerned with the same sorts of things that we're talking about. He didn't happen to be a linguist, and so he wanted to make up a name for Black English that didn't sound like Negro English, which is what it was called. Ebony was a hot term at the time. It didn't sound as dated as it does now. And if you're talking about phonics, well, he figured since this is about reading, we'll call it Ebonics. It's a moment that's so long ago, and I mean, I was only a small kid myself, but I can just smell Ebonics must have felt really cool at the time. That felt modern. It felt like people with big afros. I mean, that made sense. But it was only something used really at one conference, and there was one volume that called it that. But there was this one guy, and if you want to imagine this guy, basically imagine Al Sharpton right now. You have him in your head? Now, imagine Al Sharpton 20 years ago as opposed to the sort of statesman that he's become now. Now, change the hair, put him in a suit, and there was this guy who was kind of a linguist and kind of a doctor at the same time, named Ernie Smith, who was really big on arguing that Black English is a separate language from English, and that anybody who says otherwise is a kente cloth wearing poverty pimp. That's what he used to call people names. He actually sent me long screeds telling me that I must have a subdural hematoma because I don't think that Black English is Hebrew. It was scary. He had a major influence on a lot of school teachers. He picked up that Ebonics term. He had given it to the Oakland people. And so they were using it. And that's the only reason that we now say Ebonics. For about 10 years, I said, I'm not using that term. And then I realized everybody, it's set, and so you just have to accept it. So Ebonics, but it's chance that you and I are calling it that.
Got it. And so what is your definition of Black English and its distinction from slang?
You mean you want like one thing?
Or many?
Well, we boring people, like linguists, think of Black English as a set of grammatical constructions, which, if I may, many of you, until of course you read my book, which is the only source that's ever been written on it, many of you will think of as the mistakes Black people make when they talk. All of those things, if you put them together, they're not mistakes. They're just differences from standard English. And so when we say Black English, what we really mean is that alternate grammar. That's not really going to help for the public, and so I'm going to use something that I think is more useful. Whether you want to admit it or not, and I have a whole chapter in the book about why we need to get over pretending this isn't true. Whether you want to admit it or not, when you hear somebody talk on the phone, or if you're on the train and you don't see them, you know in an instant whether or not they're Black 99.5% of the time. We all do. To grow up in the United States is to know that. And it's not just a matter of this quote unquote bad grammar. The person may not be using any Black slang. You know in an instant. And if you're white, you've brought it up with some of your nearest and dearest and wondered whether it was racist to say anything about it. A lot of Black people know it and aren't quite sure what to do with it, and so we tell ourselves that they're white people who sound just like Black people, which there almost never are, and that we say, well, Black people just have Southern accents, as if Black people talk like Roy Moore, and we know that there is a huge difference. That's Black English. Why can you tell? It's partly the sound system, it's partly grammatical features, and to tell you the truth, the slang is the least of it. That changes every 10 minutes. But there's a different system that is a legitimate alternate. That's what Black English is.
And is Black English different from Ebonics?
No, Ebonics refers to the exact same thing.
Got it.
And so let's not use that word.
Let's call it Black English. Let's call it Black English.
No, Ebonics is stuck in, and so yeah, Ebonics.
So I find this very fascinating after reading the book because I'm Jamaican and grew up in America. So at home I spoke patois.
Jealous.
In the streets, I still speak patois. And growing up in a predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhood, I guess I spoke Black English.
You did.
Yeah, but at school and now at work, I speak standard English. Mm-hmm. So I think there's something really to be said about your argument that it's actual dialect, and it's accepted in other. Well, let's talk about the word accepted, right? It's accepted in Jamaica or in Haiti,
but there's still.
But still,
yeah.
like you can't go to work or to school speaking patois.
No.
So talk about. Why do you think it's not accepted in the U.S., and what role does racism have in that lack of acceptance?
Well, one thing that you get at usefully is that in Jamaica, there are terrible things said about patois. Mm-hmm. There are people who disavow using it. I had neighbors, for example, very educated neighbors from Jamaica who said, when I said I have studied Creole languages, that they don't speak it. I don't know how often I would hear them going up and down the steps speaking something I couldn't understand a word of.
We call those people stush.
Is there a word for that?
There's a word for that. Stush. I mean,
they
like
did
uppity.
Speak it.
Yeah.
They were, yeah, they really, and that's coming from me, and I'm kind of uppity, but yeah, they were. And so they did speak it, and that's very common. That's true of Black English, too. People who would say, I would never speak that way to my kids, and turn around and speak exactly, that way. That's how it goes with varieties that are vernacular, basically, around the world. With patois, part of why maybe it has a slightly easier time is that it's more different. So if you speak patois, you speak something where, unless I listen closely and I have a little bit of training, I don't know what you're saying. And so that's really something that's a different language. I have to wrap my ear around it. Your syntax, the prefixes and suffixes that you use are really, really different from anything that I would say most people in this room are likely to be familiar with from English. But yeah, racism is part of it. And this book got ripped in the New York Times by some individual who was mad at me. Gosh, no one's ever mad at me. Mad at me because I didn't stress racism enough in the book. And I didn't, and I wouldn't do it now because I don't think it's constructive to tell America's readers, if you don't like the way black people talk and if you think it's wrong, you're a racist. And the reason that I don't think it's effective is because I've seen that it isn't effective. You know, for 20 years, I have watched people read that argument and kind of pretend to agree, but they think to themselves, no, I'd be a racist not to call them on their bad grammar. That's perfectly reasonable. But is the reason that people think of it as such trash talk partly because people are black? Certainly, definitely. But we also have to remember, suppose it wasn't Ebonics that came out in 1997 in that controversy. Suppose it was, well, to use Roy Moore. Let's say that it was uneducated, not Alabama, let's say Mississippians, and so poor white trash Southern English. And suppose some people said, our kids don't do well in school, maybe it's because the speech that we use at home is so different, let's use it in the classroom. I don't think anybody would have thought that was wonderful. Everybody would have laughed at them too. Now, would they have laughed as hard? Would they have laughed in exactly the same way? No. But I think part of it is that we as Americans have a relatively uniform dialect. We have a relatively uniform English. There are people who speak differently. Black people especially, that's about as different as it gets unless you go to the Sea Islands and hear Gullah, or if you go to Hawaii and hear Hawaiian Pidgin. Other than that, everybody speaks variations on this one sort of the way people talk on The Office. That's just all it is. And so when we hear vernacular, when we hear something different, it's easier for Americans to think that's wrong. And we need to learn that there have always been different ways of speaking English, and that the reason that the one used in The Office is considered the best one is just chance. And so we can't help hearing that as the default. We're human beings, but it's just chance. So yeah, race plays a part, and there are books about black English. I would recommend Spoken Soul, which has a better title than mine, by John Rickford, which he wrote after the Ebonics crisis, where he gets across the racist aspect of it better than I ever could. But I figured that's been written, and with all due respect for John Rickford, who was my dissertation advisor, that argument only works with us. It doesn't spread. And so I wanted something that would have a wider suasional impact. So that's my sloppy answer to that question.
So in your chapter, it's complicated. Part of your defense of black English being a dialect is rooted in its complexities. I'll highlight a few examples, and I think everyone here will be familiar with them. So the word up and how the word up is used, like DMX, y'all gonna make me lose my mind up in here. Like,
see, what's up about it? Yeah.
What's up about it, right? Done. He done lost his mind, right? And had, which everyone, what had happened was, so can you dissect that a little bit further and talk about the complexities of black English and why that makes it a dialect?
Those things are so important because it's easy to miss it. Somebody will often tell you about black English and they'll say, well, this is a different system because you can drop off these consonants. It's a different system because you don't have to use this word for to be. It's different. It's not worse, it's just different. It's different in that you can leave this out and chop this off and drop this off, and then everybody wonders why people still don't think that it's sophisticated. You have to talk about how it's more complicated, and it tends to be in the ways which when we hear them, we think, well, that's just slang, when really it's complicated. And so, for example, the done, it's not just the past. So, for example, yesterday, what did I drink? A really bad glass of wine. So yesterday, I drank a glass of rosé. Okay, that's standard English. Yesterday, I done drunk a glass of rosé would not be how somebody who was speaking black English would say it. It's not past tense. The done is used in a very specific way. It indicates that something's counter-expectational. And so you done growed up is what you would say to somebody who's one of those people who's too tall to be 13 or something. It's counter-expectational. You done ate it doesn't mean yesterday you consumed some food. It means I was going to find it in the refrigerator and you ate it, you done ate it. That's what it means. Now, no one knows that outside of somebody who has too much time on their hands and becomes an academic, basically. But that's what it is, and Standard English doesn't have a way to indicate that in such an economic way. And so, done is complicated. Up sounds like slang. You think of Will Smith or DMX or something like that. It really indicates intimacy. So you would never say, up at the dentist's, because you're not happy there. Unless it was on a hill or something like that. But you would never say up at the dentist's. You could give away an infidelity by accident by saying, oh, I was up at Clarissa's. Well, if Clarissa just lives flat on the street, and if you're talking about it being up, how often are you there? That's what up means. And so you hear it, and usually you're dancing or something, and you think, oh, up. Black people say up too much. It means something very specific. There are a bunch of those, and so I won't take up time with what's called the narrative had, but it means that Black English has a separate tense from Standard English, and so it's not just what had happened was. You can listen to people speaking the dialect using had in a way where it's natural to think they use the pluperfect too much. But no, it's actually very specific how that had is used. So the book has a list of those things, and that list could go longer. But Black English is complicated in the same ways as it is simplified from the Standard. And it's not a forced point. It's not a matter of me sitting and trying to squeeze the last drops of water out of that washcloth thinking, well, how is it sort of complicated? It just falls out. It's just something that most people haven't had any reason to write about. So that's part of why I wrote that book.
So there's an objection, and then you speak about this in the book, but they can't talk that way at a job interview.
Mm-hmm.
And again, being Jamaican, I could never go anywhere and speak. My mother would slap me, literally patois, because it's embarrassing. It's like you come off as uneducated. So when people say you can't speak that way at a job interview, and that indicates that Black English is not acceptable, it's not a dialect. Let's talk about that. That means they missed the entire point of what Black English is. So can you talk about that some more?
Who would talk that way at a job interview?
Yeah.
And so basically, people speak different ways in different places, more than many Americans have any reason to know, for the reason I mentioned. But if somebody's response to all of this is, well, I can't talk that way at a job interview, often that seems to indicate that somehow it refutes whatever the person said before. But no, you wouldn't talk that way at a job interview, but that doesn't mean that you can't or that you shouldn't talk that way during the other 98.5% of your life. So at a job interview, yeah, you have to learn how to speak in what is arbitrarily considered the standard way. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have these alternate ways of speaking. So I have that chapter. That was something I used as a lead-in to explaining how many people around the world, such as you, have two very different ways of speaking that you toggle between, and that's how Arabs live, that is how most people in India and Sri Lanka live. More people in China live that way than are often willing to admit it, but that is very true. Mandarin is one thing, step 2 feet outside of Beijing, and often people are speaking what might as well be Vietnamese. There are different levels of Chinese in that way. So it's just ordinary. And in most of those places, nobody would say, well, you can't talk that way at a job interview, and therefore there should be no such thing as Egyptian Arabic. Nobody would say that. There is Standard Arabic and there's Egyptian Arabic. Max, because I always call you out when I'm on a stage and you're in the audience. Hi, Max. And so, Egyptian Arabic and Standard Arabic. So, the idea, well, you can't talk that way at a job interview, that's a nice statement, but nobody said that anybody wanted to. And so I bridle at that statement because it kind of gets in the way of getting across fun things like up and the had and everything else.
And there are people in the Black community that actually say these type of things.
Yeah, can't talk that way at a job interview, they say, having spoken that way their entire lives. It's just we need to cut through these sorts of biases.
And so that brings me to this notion of code switching. So we talk about that a lot here as Black Googlers because we oscillate between we're a minority, but when you see your people, you then switch into Black English.
Subconsciously.
Right, subconsciously. So how does like code switching play into this overall construct of Black English?
And Natasha, I'm going to give you the real answer on code switching. Code switching, you described what it is. It is subconscious. Nobody was talking about it with a name until roughly the 1970s. And one is expected to talk about it. And you know, I'm not being a smarty pants in saying this, but I think this is really where it fits in. Code switching, and I mean this lightly, code switching as a topic bores me to tears. Whenever a student wants to write about it, whenever I have to give a lecture on it, I just have to take a deep breath and pretend. You know, that's what we all do for about half of our lives. Code switching, Spanish and English, and wow, people in Spanish Harlem, they switch between English and Spanish. Who'd have thunk it? You know, of course they do. You know, it's basically people live between languages and between dialects, frankly, in most of the world. Bi or multilingualism is probably the norm. Nobody's ever done an exact count, but probably the norm. And so if people speak two things, then chances are that the two things are going to mix together to an extent as part of identity. Part of you is formal, and so you're going to speak your Mandarin. Part of you is normal life, and so you're going to speak the local dialect that's completely different. And of course, you're going to toggle between the two. So Black English usage is a matter of code switching too, but it also confuses the matter because somebody who studies the dialect will put up all these constructions on the board and say, well, here it is. And understandably, even a speaker thinks, that's not how I talk because I don't talk that way all day. And so they're thinking, well, it's really just something that you sprinkle in. What they mean is that we code switch. But it's a very ordinary thing. To see somebody who goes through all of their life speaking more or less the same way, as in, frankly, most educated white or blue American people, that's unusual. That's not the norm as we naturally think it is. The speech repertoire of somebody who grows up in Greenwich, Connecticut is not the norm in terms of how most people negotiate language around the world. So you, with Jamaican Black English and English, I look at you and I think you're better. You know, you have a wider English. I tried to call one book I wrote a wider English and they thought that wouldn't sell, and they were right. But you have a broader repertoire. Then there are people who have standard and black. Then there are people who only have that one thing. And, you know, life goes on. But that's unusual. And so you're better. And you're normal is the thing. You having all of that is normal. It doesn't make you exotic. Greenwich, Connecticut is exotic. So
as an example, so white Southern Americans, they code switch between.
They don't think of it that way. They say, well, I slip a little something in. No, you code switch. You have two things. But people don't get told that enough. That's part of why I wrote this, because everybody's going to read it in the whole country.
So as Black culture starts to permeate mainstream culture, do you foresee Black English becoming more accepted?
Yes, it's happening right now, right here. You just see it outside in these hallways. Something has changed profoundly in the past 20 years in particular, in the way that, not the stereotype, but this Greenwich, Connecticut person or somebody who grows up in Scarsdale, the way that person speaks is influenced by Black English in ways that nobody would have predicted before about 1995. And I think it's a good thing. It certainly doesn't mean that we're anything like past race, but in that superficial way, there's a coming together that, for example, hadn't happened when I was in college. If up at Columbia, I will see white men in particular greeting each other and talking to each other in ways that they're not thinking of as Black at all, but in terms of the sound system, in terms of the slang, in terms of even a lot of the gestures and the body language and subtle aspects of facial demeanor, they're acting Black in a way that their parents, which I hate to admit, it's at the point where I went to college with their parents, who were very cool guys, cooler than me, they didn't talk like that. They didn't move like that. They couldn't dance like that. They didn't act like that. It was a different time, and it wasn't 1927. This was like 1987. Those people's kids now are influenced by this new, does it say, did I call it lingua franca? Lingua franca in a way that nobody would have dreamed before. So yeah, it's really changing. Watch any stand-up comedian at this point and listen to a lot of the things that they do. Watch Broad City and watch Abby and Alana, and whenever they say something that's meant to be funny, about 50% of the time they're saying it in a black way. I doubt if they're thinking of it that way, but that's certainly what they do. That's new. Their mothers didn't talk that way, and their mothers were not wearing crinoline skirts. It's just that something has happened over the past generation.
What do you think that is? Is it hip hop music?
Yes.
Is it period?
Yes.
Great.
The mainstreaming of rap in the late 90s created a whole new consciousness, which shows that this is superficial, but I do think that's what did it. Yeah, definitely.
So further than that point of black culture becoming mainstream culture, this is a tough one. As people start to become more comfortable with black English, particularly,
I know what.
So, and I get this question from a ton of my white friends from college and from graduate school.
It's because it's two words.
Why can't they say the word, the N word?
Yes, it's very complicated.
Because it's particularly, hip hop culture is mainstream culture. The N word is used all the time, every other word. And it seems like we've taken the sting out of the N-word. And now that they feel like they're part of the culture, many feel like they can say the word.
It's very, very complicated. I am asked about that in some venue probably 3 or 4 times a week, including yesterday. And the first answer is anyone who says, well, if we're not supposed to use the word nigger, then it's wrong for black people to use it too. That completely misses the boat, because the black usage of it isn't the usage of it that Roy Moore's father used. I don't know anything about his, but you can tell. So not that. It became a different word, which means buddy. So when you're listening, we don't have to exoticize it. Go to the subway today when you go home. All you have to do is go like this, and you will hear some black boys using it. They don't mean what Bull Connor meant. It means buddy.
But you will also hear Hispanic kids saying it, Chinese kids. I've heard white kids saying it on the subway as well, too.
That's complicated. I remember when I first heard actually a white guy use it, and I thought, wait a minute, because I had seen him. I was in a 7-Eleven or something, and I thought, wait, he was white. Did he change? And I turned around. It was about 10 years ago, and I thought, I can tell he didn't mean that in a bad way. And I thought, this is going to continue, and it has. It's subtle, because that boy thinks that because he listens to the music, because he dresses in a certain way, moves a certain way, has had relationships with, probably a couple of black girls, he lives in a very different way, he thinks he can use it to mean buddy, because he thinks of himself as that buddy in the same positive way that black kids do. You and I see it and we think, no, you have to understand the history of the word. You know something, Natasha? I don't think we can control that. I want to say, well, that shouldn't be. And there are whole books that are written about it, and we're going to go in the subway, and we're going to keep hearing those Filipino boys, those Asian boys. I'm now hearing Chinese American kids doing it. Can we fix that? I don't think so. They're not listening. And if any of them learn to listen, then the younger ones coming up, I think we have to get used to that. And I'm not saying that it doesn't make me bristle too, but there's some things you can't fix. I don't think you can fix that Chinese couple of guys saying that any more than you could stop black guys from saying it, or black women. So it's a weird thing. But the response to it, it's just like they can't talk that way at a job interview. The response to it is not simply, we can't use it, so how come those black men can use it? It's 2 words. But the question is, what do you do about that second version when other people start taking it up? It's hard. It's a hard one. It's a tough one.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
I still don't accept that I always say something, and I have to. But I guess as Black English becomes more acceptable, that's probably one of the downsides of it, is that we're going to.
I would have to agree. And there are people who are going to go to their graves not liking what they hear.
No.
That's hard. I don't intend to die. But most people seem to just accept it, and they are going to go underground. And that's it.
So I think we have some questions in the audience. Thank you. Hi. Thank you.
Hey, so I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
I moved to this country when I was 16. My sister was 3 years younger than me, and I noticed she picked up a lot of what you described, right, Black English, and I didn't. And I think there was this slight difference in where we were in our formative years that allowed her to pick up parts of this language that I never ended up doing, even though we lived in the same household. And listening to what you talk about how it's been spreading, something was in the back of my mind. I hear a lot about this idea of cultural misappropriation, but it feels like there's a slightly different power dynamic at work here. And I'm curious about what that is, because I can't quite put my finger on it.
Well, see, that's one of those things, because your sister would have been picking up these ways of speaking and probably moving and joking without thinking about it. It's not like she did it on purpose. That happened because of who she was around. And it may not have even been from Black girls. She could have gotten it from other girls of whatever. And so that's her reality. And some people would say that that's cultural appropriation, but I don't know. I don't know your sister, but I've got a picture. And I'm not sure that I would accuse her of anything in terms of cultural appropriation. She was busy studying and watching TV. So she didn't know. And I don't think that I could condemn her for whatever she's saying and doing and however she's moving. So there is a such thing as cultural appropriation, but I am unpopular in some circles in saying that, no, it's not appropriation for people to start talking more like Black people, simply because I am not aware. I'm also not an anthropologist, but I play one on TV. I am not aware of any world historical situation where people came together and didn't start sharing. I don't know where that was. People from above take from people below take from people above. I don't know how you would stop that. And so for cultural appropriation, the argument sounds to me like people are saying, in particularly the situation of the descendants of African slaves in a misbegotten country called the United States of America in the beginning of the 21st century, and only then, only in that situation, people are going to come together and not mix. It doesn't strike me as something that has any chance of happening. And so I'd rather be unhappy about things that I can change. That's my personal view. Most advocates of Black English would not have given you that answer. Don't take me as representative, but I've got to be me.
Thanks. I think we have another question here.
Thanks for coming, first
Sure.
of all. You mentioned that rap was a huge influence in the rise of Black English outside the African-American community. In my recollection, gangster rap seemed like one of the things that really helped bring this on, and it was a very aggressive, angry message that they had, and it resonated with a lot of people, but it also came from a place of street toughness. And I'm wondering if that became part of the modern association of that kind of language with these guys who were mad, who were poor, who weren't going to take it anymore, and has that sort of had like negative influence or negative perceptions of Black English even today?
It helps, certainly. I think that the association of Black speech with this violence and the street can be taken a little further back to the 60s. I think that a lot of that started with what was called the long, hot summers and the prelude to it. So there's this new idea that Black speech is somehow angry or menacing, but certainly that was focused by the tone of the rap that was most popular at that time. And I think there's an extent to which any teenager, and this is almost gender neutral, it's probably more among boys, but there's a tendency to think of aggression and sticking it to the oppressor, to the man, or to your parents as authenticity, as something that one does as a teen. And so it played into that. It's something that, white boys were doing in different ways in 1973. But it certainly was a useful source for striking those sorts of poses. And I think, it still is in general, to the extent that that Black vibe is associated with giving the finger to the authorities. People still use it in that way. It can be a good thing and a bad thing at the same time.
So I was reading a while back, 1984, and in the novel, Orwell kind of touches upon how language can inform consciousness, and I had remembered Oh, also, he's not a linguist, right? And neither am I. So like, this could be like a stupid question.
Orwell was brilliant. You probably are too.
So you had mentioned before that there's probably some superficiality in how Black English has spread through the popularization of hip hop. And I don't want to like challenge that, but I just want to ask if it is the case, like if language does inform consciousness, then does the spread of Black English actually have some sort of impact that maybe we're not probing in how we look at and relate to each other? It doesn't necessarily even need to be on racial lines, but...
You know what? I'm going to give you the real answer for that instead of the prepackaged one, because the real one, predictably, is more interesting, but it's less certain. This is something, I haven't gotten to this yet. There are people who are studying what makes Black English different all the time. A lot of what I put in books like this is from watching the research being done and thinking, oh, that's interesting. For example, it was one person only about 8 years ago who figured out done. That had bested everybody, including me. I have one early book where I made something up about it. I had no idea, but I knew nobody would catch me on it because nobody knew. Somebody actually figured it out. And you know what they're figuring out? And I don't get the feeling that the others are noticing this pattern, but I've wondered whether I should go public with it, and then I just, I had a second child. But a lot of Black English's constructions carry a certain indignation, proportionally more than I'm used to seeing in other human speech varieties. I don't want that to be true. I find it peculiar, but very often when you find, actually, wait a minute, that's grammar, it's kind of angry grammar. And so, for example, there's a future perfect in Black English, be done, which I don't think I mentioned in this book. I be done killed him if he does that again. The truth with be done is that it's grammatically very sophisticated, but it's only used when you're angry. You don't talk about it when you're talking about drinking juice or something like that. There are various constructions where I think, what is it about culture, history, and these constructions? Is there a reason for that? And linguists distrust linking language and culture too tightly, and I also don't want to call this wonderful dialect angry, but on the other hand, there are some reasons that Black people might have for being angry, and so I don't know, and I really mean it. I have meant to look into it, and I keep getting sidetracked, but
my question,
maybe.
I think more so than culture is specifically behavior itself, right? Like if I raised a child, right, and he was inundated in an angry grammar, would he behave in an angrier way?
That relationship, no. If the child was raised with angry grammar, that is the title of something I'm going to write. If the child is raised with angry grammar, but the child is not raised in an angry life, that angry grammar will make the child infinitesimally more angry in ways that you could isolate in some silly psychological experiment. The grammar alone will not have him walking out of the house with a club. No.
Right.
Grammar does not do that. It would be infinitesimal. But culture and language do have an influence on each other. The angry culture is, I think, of more concern than the angry future perfect. But one does wonder about such things.
Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay, because you gave me a title.
We have a question here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming.
Sure.
So my question is actually kind of going back to your question about the N-word, because I actually disagree with like the concept of having to just accept it. And the reason for that is because I feel as though there are a lot of other communities that also have, similar words that the general populace, say, for example, in the LGBTQ community, the use of the F word, they may use it with amongst their own community, but at the end of the day, I don't feel compelled to call anyone that. And so I guess I feel as though there are certain exceptions that are made when it comes to the N-word, when it comes to other people wanting to use it in our community, and sort of like the acceptance of like, hey, we just have to deal with the fact that it's going to happen and it's just going to happen. What exactly about sort of, I guess, Black language or sort of Black culture, et cetera, do you feel makes people feel as though they have to make that concession, A, and B, are there other types of like quote unquote concessions that we feel like we just have to, it's gonna happen, we can't do anything about it, and people are gonna want to participate in a certain way where, when you look at it, and transpose it into other communities in similar situations, you can't really understand why you would want to. I know it's kind of long-winded.
This is the viral clip with Ta-Nehisi Coates 2 or 3 weeks ago where he makes a similar point. And the response to it is this. That is a rich question. I mean, that's a huge, one must compare. Why is it that nobody is walking around trying to use the F word? And there are exactly 4 answers, and I'm going to forget one of them. One of them is that there's a difference between the word that ends in ER and the word that ends in A. And so it's not that white boys are trying to use the ER one. It's the A one where that word is thought of as having a different meaning than the nasty one. That's one part. Second is, why is it only black people? And the thing is, to the extent that anybody agrees that America is all about race and that that's the substrate, that's part of why it would be black people rather than LGBT or whatever Indians call each other, et cetera, that would attract that kind of attention, especially because of, third point, the music. And so the music becomes America's mainstream music in a way that nobody would have expected. And the music, especially a lot of it in the recent past, uses that buddy word all the time. So you've got that in your ears, and especially with modern technology, you walk around with it, it's in your ears all the time. And so that also, it's not only that America's all about race, but America becomes all about hip hop, and that word is in it. And then finally, it's because especially boys like calling each other salty, affectionate names. And so, for example, there's a Seinfeld episode where George Costanza picks up calling his friends bastard from these white men. And it's like, hey, bastard, hey, bastard. And that, or, you know, a certain generation of white men, that son of a bitch, and that's affectionate. That word ending in A is that. All of that, I think, comes together and means that that's why people want it to be that word. Whereas let's say that gay men walked around calling each other, if I may, faggot affectionately all the time. I don't know if they do. That would be less likely to jump the rails because there is no gay hip hop that people are listening to all the time. It has a lot to do with the centrality of blackness in the culture. That's my explanation. And because I feel that all that is so big and I feel so weak, I accept that the white boy is going to say nigga. People would disagree with me on that. I don't think that I have any kind of word of God on that, as opposed to so many other things. But on this question, I just have an opinion. But I think that's why. I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates' version of it, with all due respect to him, is a little oversimplified. There's a reason why the black word would get so much attention. One of them is that black is everything, and another is that there are 2 of those words. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi. You talked about the "you can't use that in a job interview" line as being not the point because, like, we all know that. But would you say it's necessarily problematic that we can't do that because it means that some people have a much harder time in that socially important area? Like, should we be able to tolerate that in a job interview, or is that also not the point? There
should be no such thing as standard English. It's an abomination. We're stuck with it. That's just the way it's going to be. I'm a fatalist. But no, nobody would have any trouble with comprehension in any real way if everybody could just talk and write the way they wanted to in this country. Wouldn't work in Italy or Germany where there's more variation. But here, it's an arbitrary thing. So yes, I do think it's a shame. A person who doesn't feel comfortable in standard English should be able to do an interview the way they talk because it would affect comprehension not at all, and they'd be more articulate talking the way they're used to talking. That day will never come. But yes, if I could wave a magic wand. And really, it's true. When I think about waving that magic wand, there are always 3 things, and it's funny how it changes throughout my life. One of them, now my 3 are, nobody would ever be hungry. The idea that people are walking around in the world sometimes without enough to eat. That. 2, love would be based on the inside rather than the outside. The idea that looks matters, I think that's just horrible. 3rd, no standard language, really. Everybody should just be able to talk the way they want to talk, and everything would be fine. But we're just stuck with the reality on all 3 of those things.
Question over here.
I'm hoping that this isn't as open-ended as I think it is. A lot of what's changed in the 21st century versus the 20th is that we have online communication. And specifically in the last few years, you have phones and keyboards coercing you towards a standardized English. So for instance, I will type in on my phone, and several of my friends complained to me about the ducking L train this morning. And you
I'm
get
nodding in complete ignorance.
and you
The ducking, what?
they wanted to type a different word, but they're
Oh, got it. Oh, okay. Continue, sorry.
And so this happens on a spell check, and this happens on a grammatical sense, and it happens a lot in a coercive way towards a standard, very polite English, because a lot of companies say, oh, we shouldn't autocorrect towards another word because that's a naughty word. How do you feel that that will change the way people speak, and how should we change that, if at all?
You are, put it this way. There are two forms of language. There's speaking, and then there's writing. And we write informally today to an extent that we didn't before. But really, the two things are very different. And so the truth is that whatever autocorrect does or doesn't do has, I don't mean this in a flippant way, but it has no significant effect on the way people speak. And we speak a lot more, most of us, than we write. However, in general, people are spontaneously bidialectal in writing as well as in speech. So there are going to be things that go on keyboards that really, in the grand scheme of things, mean that you can choose to be or force yourself to be informal or formal. The decisions that people make in terms of how these things correct or don't, they're always interesting. But I don't think that they're going to affect the basic sense that, one, language is speech, and two, even when we're writing, we'll always be able to do it in different ways. So for example, the word ducking, so to speak, it's not going away no matter what some program, tries to do, especially because that's primarily a spoken word. So we'll see, but I take your point. Yeah.
I think we have one more question here.
Hey, good to see you.
Max is one of my students from Columbia. Hi, Max.
Hi, Max.
Hey, so with the prevalence of American pop culture and music worldwide and its influence, do you see any interesting effects of Black English on other Englishes worldwide or even other languages?
I do, because it's not only here in the United States. Because of the music, that way of speaking English is having an effect in other parts of the world, including among people who have no sense of whatever the social parameters are. They just do it, and also use the language of that place in a way that has a Black affect. I've heard rap in Germany where I was thinking, this is Black German, and most of these people have never met an American Black person in their lives. And it's ironic. Once I was in New Guinea. I spent a short week in New Guinea, and everything was completely different. The food, Indonesian is nothing like any language any of us have probably ever known. It was about 200 degrees the whole time. The whole sense of where a bathroom is and what it's like, even in formal situations, was something that one had to learn as one went, so to speak. It was absolutely amazing. The one thing that was the most familiar was that the boys, including many of them who, compared to Americans, are much smaller. I was so tall in this place. The boys could rap in English, sounding exactly like Jay-Z, even when they didn't really speak English. They speak Indonesian, but they could go right into it. That or Usher. A lot of them could just sing exactly like Usher, when I could barely have a conversation with them otherwise. That was something I found very interesting in terms of music making. And so 10 minutes ago, somebody in New Guinea making music, God knows what they did, I don't know. Today, a young boy in New Guinea who makes music gets up with gestures and movements and a sense of accompaniment and a sense of attitude and that word we've been talking about, even if it's in some language we've never heard of. That's absolutely fascinating to me. It's everywhere. No one would have expected this 20 minutes ago. And here we are in this minute. That's the answer.
So we have a question from Jonathan.
So, thank you, Dr. McWhorter, Professor McWhorter. Really appreciate all the expertise that you provided. One question that I have, though, is when we talk about language, at least in the American context, about Black English, there seems to be no way to separate the etymology of the language and the political nature and the way that it's received and the way it's treated. So when we talk about the boring code switching papers and things like that, it seems like part of that's connected to the fact that there is a weight to the type of switching that one particular part of the community or the population has to do versus others, and a question of power. So when we talk about the future of how Black English is accepted academically, accepted culturally, and accepted just in general as a language, how do you think we have to come to terms with the political and power aspect? Because it seems that, at least within the American context, it wasn't just by chance that what we consider standard English became standard English, but it was an act of power, an act of politics. And the way that Black English has traditionally been treated and code switching has been treated has been also an act of political power, political subjugation, or the way that certain communities have embraced it has been a counteract of power. So how, as an academic, as someone who researches this, how do you come to terms, and how does the academic community come to terms with that idea of not only understanding there is a aspect of language that is organic and changing and things like that, but also that there is a political and power aspect as well?
That's a very good question. Most of the people who study Black English, and honestly, what I do in linguistics is such that I've got a couple of toes in Black English study, enough to write this, but it's not my main thing. So that community, I know them, like them, but that's not where I go to 5 conferences a year. Most of that community would feel that what we need to do is change those power relations, that we need to change the way people think. And often, many of them say that standard English is a gatekeeper language, and it's not fair that a Black speaker should have to learn that at all, which I think intellectually is true. So the idea is that we need to change society. That is a respectable view. It is not my politics. I'm just not that idealistic. So they are leftists. God bless the leftists. I'm more liberal in this sense. I don't see how society is going to change the way a lot of them do, which puts me at odds with some academics. But I think this is what I think we can get. I don't think we're going to change that there's a degree of inequality. I hope that in 100 years that inequality is not so tracked to skin color. But I don't imagine that there will be no inequality. What I think is feasible is to teach succeeding generations of Americans, succeeding generations of Americans, that different forms of language are different but not worse. So, of course, people are going to keep saying you can't use it in a job interview, and somebody like me will say, you have spoken a true thing. Yes, but the point is, if one can hear Black English and not hear junk, but can just think it's different, the way somebody in Milan hears somebody speaking Milanese Italian and thinks it's different, it's not junk. That's as far as I imagine it getting. Now, are people who are hearing that still probably going to think of Black people as lesser human beings? That's going to be a harder fight. My attempt to kind of pull a few bricks out of that wall is to try to make it clear to people who will listen. And I find that if you put it the right way, a critical mass do, what you're hearing as mistakes isn't. And I definitely try to pull the racism out of that equation because it makes people feel threatened. Should it? Probably, yeah. But still, you want to keep their minds open. So that's what I think. Again, that's not representative. Many people who study the dialect would have a more revolutionary approach than I do. Maybe I'm a little cynical. But I think that we need to be able to hear all non-standard speech, but especially Black English, as interesting rather than broken down. So that's my mission.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Well, we're unfortunately out of time, but we just want to thank you on behalf of everyone here.
Thank you all for
everyone
coming.
here at Google.
Thank you.
This has been awesome. Thanks for dropping some knowledge up in here.
Dropped it. Thank you.